I already spent half an hour recording this, but the data got corrupted, so now I'm doing it again.
Evolution predicts that we should have fossils of the simplest creatures at the bottom of the rock layers, showing a time when life supposedly started evolving on Earth.
It's just that some of the lowest rock layers with fossils, called Cambrian, reveal incredibly complicated creatures right at the start.
Right at the start? No. The Cambrian period was about 500 million years ago, but the first forms of life appeared about 4 billion years ago. There were literal eons between those times. There's plenty of time for it to evolve.
If evolution were true, we would expect to see single-celled organisms down there, then basic-looking multi-celled creatures above them.
No, if evolution is true, then we might see traces of unicellular organisms in rocks that are about 4 billion years old, and more complex organisms in rocks that are younger than them. And we do.
Instead, we see Cambrian layers full of very complex sea creatures with no clear ancestors in the lower rocks. The Cambrian presents a dramatic explosion in animal varieties.
That's actually true. We don't have many clear fossils of their ancestors, but that's because of the sudden and dramatic diversification, and also because some animals were better able to be fossilized in the Cambrian period, like trilobites, whose armor was made of calcium carbonate as opposed to chitin. At any rate, God did it is not the best explanation for these fossils.
Including an example from every one of today's major groups, plus more besides.
I have no idea what you mean by major groups, but there's absolutely no trace of land mammals in the Cambrian period. In fact, there's no trace of animals that we see today in the Cambrian period. The animals that we see today are incredibly different and more complex than the animals in the Cambrian period. There's no denying that, yet you want to say that they all appeared at the same time, and that evolution is impossible. Even when staring at the evidence, you can't admit the truth. But there are some transitional fossils within the Cambrian period, like the lobopods, which are transitional between arthropods and worms.
They just appear suddenly in the layers.
Okay, well you got me with that one, but I'm gonna nail it with this one. I'm swinging with transitional fossils this time.
I use my fastball since you're trying to pull a fast one. The expected transitional fossils are missing.
Okay, what do you mean there are no transitional fossils?
Well, in Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species, he wrote, "Why, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms?"
I love it when creationists quote Darwin, because it's virtually always from On the Origin of Species, and it's never Darwin's actual ideas. Instead, it's in chapter 6, where Darwin acknowledges criticisms of evolution before he answers them. In this particular case, Darwin starts off by pointing to chapter 9, or chapter 10 in the 6th edition, where he points out the imperfections in the geological record. And, among other things, he points out that fossils are just really difficult to form. But it's not like you care about Darwin's actual ideas, you just like the cherry-picked quotes.
And he hoped future fossil digs would reveal the transitional forms. Since then, for more than 150 years, mankind has been collecting fossils. We have over 200 million in museums.
So in other words, most animals that have lived on Earth have been fossilized and discovered?
Right.
Wrong. The number of species that we have fossils of is nowhere near the number of species that we see alive today, suggesting that there are tons more species that we don't have fossils of. And we have far more fossils of animals with hard parts, like bones and shells, than of soft-bodied organisms. No credible scientist would ever say that the fossil record is anywhere near complete. But it doesn't have to be in order for it to be evidence.
And if evolution were true, we should have millions of fossils that show us the evolution between all these animals, since evolution is a gradual process.
Except for the fact that fossils are incredibly difficult to form, and it's also not easy to find the fossils that do form. But we do have transitional fossils for some animals, like humans, whales, horses, flatfish, birds, and the ancestors of tetrapods. But it's not like you're going to accept the evidence.
Look right here. In both of these textbooks, they showed pictures of the Archaeopteryx fossil, supposedly half dinosaur and half bird.
Yeah, it was discovered in 1861. Alan Fiducia, a paleontologist who led studies in the origins of birds, said this back in 1993. Paleontologists have tried to turn Archaeopteryx into an earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It's a bird, a perching bird. No amount of paleobabble is going to change that.
Well, this guy's view is against the scientific consensus, which seems to be a major theme here. But there are major features that the Archaeopteryx had that indicated that it was a dinosaur. It had no bill, it had a jaw with sharp teeth, it had 3 fingers with claws, a long tail with bones, a nose that is far forward, and many features of its skeleton, like the way the neck is attached to the skull and unfused pelvis bones. But the Archaeopteryx isn't the only transitional species between dinosaurs and birds that we have. For example, we have the dromaeosaurs and the troodontids.
Since making that statement, there has been a constant battle in the evolutionary camp about whether Archaeopteryx should be even considered an ancestor to birds.
Well, yeah, but it's pretty much just this guy against the widely held consensus. And the issue isn't whether birds came from this particular species or not, but instead whether birds came from archosaurs or theropods. Our knowledge of bird ancestry just isn't complete, and that's okay. Transitional fossils don't have to show a complete lineage. Because of how few species are actually preserved, we usually just find animals that are related to the ancestors, not necessarily the direct ancestors themselves.
And many are making the case that it should be thrown out of the evolutionary lineup, going from being a bird to a dinosaur and then back to a bird.
No, it's both. It's an avian dinosaur.
Archaeopteryx was even further disqualified as an evolutionary ancestor for birds when scientists found what appears to be a crow-sized bird and extinct 4-winged birds in rock layers designated to be below those containing Archaeopteryx.
What? How does another transitional fossil disqualify the Archaeopteryx as evidence? What you're talking about and showing a picture of is the Microraptor, which isn't a bird at all, it's a dinosaur. And it is relatively closely related to birds, but none of this disproves the transition between dinosaurs and birds.
Wild pitches happen often in the game of evolution, like the fossil called Tiktaalik. It quickly became the missing link between fish and 4-legged creatures that first walked on land.
Oh yeah, I heard of that. It was kind of the star of transitional fossils.
But then, in 2010, scientists announced in the journal Nature that they had found footprints of a 4-legged land creature in Poland that are supposedly 10 million years older than Tiktaalik. So there goes Tiktaalik as a clear transitional fossil, and yet, here it is, still in our textbook.
I looked this up, and yes, there does seem to be footprints and therefore tetrapods older than the Tiktaalik. But that doesn't mean that they didn't evolve. Nor does it mean that the Tiktaalik isn't a transitional fossil. The point is that the Tiktaalik is at least related to the ancestors of tetrapods and can be used to indicate a transition of traits.
Like I said, there should be millions of transitional fossils. So if evolutionary theory can only suggest a few, and those few have major problems, it discredits the theory.
Except that you're living in a fantasy world where we can be expected to have fossils of every single species and trace exact lineages, and where dissenting opinion is absolute evidence against the scientific consensus. The reality is that there are very few species that are fossilized and found, and transitions aren't always clear. So we have to infer based on the fossils that we have, and, especially in the big picture, evolution is still the best explanation we have for it.
Okay, so that last one was definitely a strike. Evolution theory holds that Darwin's evolution tree started simple and then branched out to all the amazing animals we have today.
We see that there are many more kinds of animals than we have today.
And many of those went extinct?
Opposite of evolution.
Not at all. In fact, that's expected. As animals and selective pressures change, and as newer species compete with older ones, then it's not crazy at all to think that animals could go extinct. What, do you expect animals to survive magically? Do you expect them never to change? Because that would be the opposite of evolution.
Wow, the idea that the fossil record shows a worldwide flood was a home run!
Yep, fossil graveyards containing animals from land, sea, and air all jumbled together.
I couldn't find any information on these fossil graveyards except an ICR article that doesn't cite scientific sources but instead some author. But a localized flood isn't out of the question, and there are several ways in which a land animal could end up in sea. Maybe it drowned, or maybe it died near the shore and got swept away.
And in many cases, the destruction was so powerful that fossilized creatures were ripped apart and buried quickly in mud.
Is the entire world flooding really the best explanation for that, and not predators?
And 95% of the entire record is marine fossils buried mostly in land rocks, not ocean bottom sediments.
Well, the land that is now above water was once underwater. Tectonic plates move.
Many layers that contain fossils are so large that they stretch over many states and sometimes cross continents.
Well, how would there even be multiple layers? If it was all deposited at the same time, there would just be one big layer. And especially not multiple layers of the same kind of rock, like we see all around us.
That definitely sounds like a lot of water.
Well, where did that water come from? In order for the entire Earth to flood over, you need about 3 times the amount of water that is within our entire hydrosphere to magically fall from the sky. And more importantly, to just subside as if it was no big deal. And evolution is the crazy idea?